right, now the best way to remember the structure of plant cells is to practice drawing them. And it's not hard. I'm just going to show you how to do that. So we're going to call this our plant cell drawing. Now, plant cells are really defined by a big thick wall that goes all the way around them, and that's known as the cellulose cell wall. It's a thick structure. It's full of pores and holes to allow water to pass through and anything dissolved in water, so it doesn't really stop anything getting in and out of the cell. But what it does do is it gives structure to plants, and we'll see how that works in just a second. So plant cells tend to be rather regular because these cell walls, irregular in shape, because these cell walls are rather stiff. So you'll tend to see plant cells having rather straight sided structure. Let me just draw a cell wall. It's a thick structure that we have around a plant, and plant cells will generally have a kind of angular shape with straightish sides. I mean, the straightish sides occur because on each other side of the plant cell we're going to have another plant cell, and we're going to have its cell wall. So if we imagine this is the cell wall from the plant cell that we are drawing, and we'll just colour it in green because I like to do that. This cell wall is made of a substance called cellulose, which is kind of ironic, really, because I'm colouring in the very thing that it's made of, which is paper. The paper that I'm using to draw here is made of cellulose as well. Cellulose is a stiff, tough material made from sugars. It doesn't seem like it, because when you eat a piece of paper it doesn't taste very good, but it is. It's made of sugar. Now, either side of this we have other plant cells, and each one of those plant cells has its own cell wall. Okay? And we'll just draw a couple in for reference. So this is the cell wall of this cell, and this is the cell wall of this cell. So each cell makes its own cell wall. I can just keep going around, and we can draw in the cell walls of the surrounding plant cells. And that's it, nice and easy. Now the cellulose cell wall, we're going to label it up here, so let's label it. Our label will touch the structure that we're labeling, and we'll call that the cellulose cell wall. Now, other organisms have cell walls. Fungi have cell walls. Bacteria have cell walls. But only plant cells are made of, only plant cell walls are made of cellulose. So remember that. If you're talking about a cellulose cell wall, it's a plant cell you're talking about. Now, as I say, they don't block things from getting in and out. They simply add structure. And the way you add structure to plants is by pumping up the inside of the cell wall with pressure. And that's done inside the cell in a structure known as the vacuole, which we'll come to in a second. But if you can imagine those ice cube bags that you get for the freezer, when you take them off the roll, they're just flat, limp plastic bags, but you fill them up with water. Each of the little ice cube spaces inside the plastic bag fills up with water, and the whole thing becomes rather stiff. And that's essentially what happens in plants. So we've got the cellulose cell wall. Now, what is it that stops things from getting in and out of the cell? Well, that is the job of the cell membrane, which I'm going to try and draw in a different color. Now I'm going to put the cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane you can't see in a microscope. It's too thin. It's only a few molecules across. But I'm going to represent it in this cell with a red line just inside the cell wall. Now, if this is a healthy plant cell, that cell membrane has been pushed right up against the cell wall on the outside, and we will just see it as a thin red line. I hope you can see this in the video. It may not show up terribly well, but there's a little thick bit. I'm going to take that red line, and I'm going to use that as my marker, and we're going to call that the cell membrane. Now you see how much thinner the cell membrane is compared to the cell wall. You mustn't confuse these two things. It's a classic question. Every single exam will ask you to choose between a cell wall and a cell membrane in one question. So you just need to remember it. The cell membrane is sometimes known as the plasma membrane. In a number of textbooks, they'll call it the plasma membrane. A number of diagrams you'll see online, they'll call it the plasma membrane. Now, the cell membrane in complex cells, in eukaryotic cells, plants, animals, fungi, is also used inside the cell. Cell membrane structures are used inside the cell, and in this particular case, there's a big structure inside every plant cell called the central vacuole. So this is kind of a big bubble inside every cell that's completely surrounded by cell membrane. And we're going to call that the large central vacuole. Now, this is how the plants maintain their structure. What they do is they pump water into the large central vacuole. That pushes the whole cell against the cell wall, and that gives structure to the plant. All the cells around, they pump up and they stiffen the whole plant, and the thing stands up. If you don't give water to your plant, they won't have any water to pump up their cells with, and they wilt and fall over and die eventually. You can recover them. Plants are quite good at recovering from drought, some plants. But in the main, if you want to keep your plant healthy, give it plenty of water, because it needs water in its cells to stay upright. That's how a plant's skeleton essentially works, by pumping up with water. Hydrostatic pressure it's called. Okay, so now we have our cellulose cell wall, which surrounds the plant. We have our cell membrane, which stops things getting in and out of the plant cell. And we have our large central vacuole, which we pump up inside the cell in order to keep the thing stiff and upright. Between these two things, we have the rest of the cell. And so that area is going to be full of cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is the kind of thicker, watery solution inside the cell where all the cell's chemical reactions take place. So that whole area in there is full of a kind of thicker, more sugary, maybe slightly more salty solution that chemical reactions take place in. Okay. Every cell, certainly every complex cell, plants, animals, fungi, protists, has a cell nucleus. I'm just going to draw that in here. That will tend to be the biggest structure that you can see if you look down a light microscope. Now the nucleus, which I'm colouring in just brown here, lives within the cytoplasm area of the cell. And inside it is the DNA of the plant. And the DNA of the plant organizes the cell. It sends out messages to tell the cell what proteins to make. So we're going to call that the nucleus of the cell. So far so good. We've got our cell membrane, which surrounds the outside of the cell, and we have and it also is used to make the large central vacuole. We have our cell wall, which gives structure to the plant but doesn't stop anything going in and out of the cell. The cell membrane does that. The cell membrane's job is to stop things getting in and out. It controls what passes one way and the other. We'll talk about that later. The cytoplasm is where the chemical reactions of the cell occur. So this is a thicker, more reactive medium, and the nucleus makes the proteins. Now, plant cells have, a particular plant cell in a leaf is filled up with structures called chloroplasts. Now, chloroplasts are responsible, I'm just going to draw them in here as little green circles. Chloroplasts fill up these plant cells if those plant cells are exposed to the light. So you'll see these in leaf cells. The leaf is the photosynthesizing organ of plants. You'll see them in stem cells of herbaceous plants, which are green. If you look at herbaceous plants like your herbs in the kitchen, parsley, sage, that kind of stuff, they all have green stems. So this is what gives the color green to plants. The chloroplasts are filled up with green pigment called chlorophyll. Again, we'll come to this in later lessons, and that's a chloroplast. So far good, carries out photosynthesis. And the only other thing we want to pay attention to is that every complex cell, plant cells, animals, cells, fungal cells, has a structure in it called a mitochondrion. I'll just draw a couple because plant cells tend not to be very active. Mitochondria are the things that convert glucose into ATP, that convert a complex energy molecule into a simpler energy molecule that can be used for cellular reactions. So we'll come to that again later. Chondrion is singular. 2 mitochondria, 1 mitochondrion. The only thing that's really missing from this diagram, at this scale we would see them as very, very tiny, but we have maybe some tiny little ribosomes in around the nucleus. You'll see them more around the nucleus than anywhere else because what they do is they take a message from the nucleus and they translate that message into proteins for the cell. Okay, so there you go. There's your plant cell with all the major structures drawn on and labeled. And if you practice drawing the plant cell, you'll remember what each one of these does. Go through the process, remind yourself of the function of each structure as you draw it, and take off the structures as you go. That's how you can easily remember the structure of plant cells. We'll look at animal cells in our next lesson.